Psalm 124 is identified by Adin Steinsaltz as a response to Psalm 123. Yesterday we read that 4-verse psalm that ends as if the psalmist has run out of the capacity to speak, so overwhelmed, if you will, by life. Psalm 124 also acknowledges life as dangerous, a building of near-death like experiences. Short psalm, 8 verses, but a psalm that is of communal thanksgiving to God for having survived. Not unlike Psalm 123, there are these incremental repetitions that build intensity. Repetition of words. The fancy term is anadiplosis, of almost like steps by words being repeated. The intensity that gets built in Psalm 124 is probably also in the context of communal song. You'll see the opening, verse 1, is almost a call to people to respond, both with idea, but since psalms are sung by and large in the temple, this psalm even more has a feeling of a call of a choral master. That's Robert Alter's emphasis, to have those sing first to acknowledge the dangers and then the triumph, that God has been there to help overcome those challenges. And so we'll put up the psalm, and then we'll go back and look at it more closely. I take the title from the opening 2 verses. If not for Adonai who was for us, Lulei Adonai Shahaya Lanu. If not, then the end. It would have all been over. Just to be aware, in terms of repetition, Nafshenu, our life, our soul, is repeated 3 times, and that this is a psalm about near-death experiences, and that is only increased by another word, which is God's name, which is repeated 4 times, and it's in the plural. This is a psalm of national thanksgiving. And do note that the one verse that does not have, that kind of stands alone in it, is verse 6. And that verse 6 uniquely will not have a repeating word. Otherwise, every verse has those incremental repetitions except verse 6. One last thing to know before I read it, and that is, there's always this inclusio, the bracketing. And here's something interesting about the bracketing, about verses 1 and 8, which also stand apart from the rest of the psalm, as you'll see. Though verse 1 is a focus on Israel, declare now Israel. And in that sense, it has a sense of a national prayer of thanksgiving. And verse 8, which again stands apart from the flow of the psalm, is a description of God as maker of heaven and earth. So it opens with a national feel and closes with God in this universal dimension, and in between, danger. Psalm 124, if not for Adonai, who was for us? A song of ascents of David. If not for Adonai, who was for us? Declare now Israel. If not for Adonai, who was for us when rising up against us a mortal. Surely, alive, they would have swallowed us when their anger flared against us. Surely, the waters would have swept us away. The stream would have passed over our soul. Surely, it would have passed over our soul, the treacherous waters. Blessed is Adonai, who did not give us over as prey for their teeth. Our soul is like a bird, escaped from the snare of fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. And so this is the rare Psalm of Ascent that begins with Le David. Usually it's Shir Hamalot, as it was yesterday. In this case, I might surmise that the inclusion of David is because this is a psalm about overcoming danger. And throughout David's life, his life was one of coming close to danger repeatedly. Not clear, but that's a possibility. And now this introduction, Lule Adonai Shahaya Lanu, which one way to translate it is as this phrase, Lule, if not for Adonai who was for us. Other ways that the phrase Lule is translated as is Steinsaltz, had it not been for, or many of the other translations, were it not for. But it's also if not for, which is, by the way, also how it's done in King James. This phrase, Lule. Lule ha-Adonai, if not for Adonai. And again, that name of relationship between Israel and God is the Yud He Vav He. Verse 1, if not for Adonai who was for us, that's the strong statement, but it leaves you wondering, if not what? What happened? Declare now Israel. And now it's as if the chorus is answering, if not for Adonai who was for us when rising up against us a mortal, but we're still left with verses 1 and 2 hanging. What was it that happened that we were dependent on God for? And it won't really be answered. We don't know here what's the moment, what's the event, what's the prompt. In fact, what's somewhat different in this case is the psalm is not an address to God like it was yesterday. Yesterday's psalm began directly addressing God. This is different. This is not an address, but a reflection. It's as if there's a sweep of time rather than a specific event, and that in this recollection of the past, there's a greater awareness that if not for God's quality of protection from all kinds of dangers, we would not have survived. And you can see how this psalm was also read throughout the Middle Ages as a description of the dangers of exile, and it being looking forward as a psalm to be recited at a later time. So Rabbi David Kimchi, as an example, that often cited Spanish medieval commentator, will say that this is a description of exile itself. And it might be, modern commentators would say, perhaps this is about the Babylonian exile. For particularly this reference to God as B'Shem Adonai, in the name of God, toward the end, which we also saw in Psalm 121, is a later use of addressing God. It's kind of once removed in the name of God, though there's a hint of that in Deuteronomy, which often, for modern Bible scholars, points to being written either during exile or soon after exile, that being specifically the Babylonian exile, which began in the year 586 before the Common Era. And so here is a psalm that was read after the year 70 and the destruction of the Second Temple as a psalm of hope making, that although there are dangers, we will survive because God is even with us in exile. Now, if not for Adonai, who was for us, and now there's this added part in verse 2, when rising up against us a mortal. Who that mortal is, again, is undefined. It doesn't seem to be Persia, which is because the mortal is going to get described pretty negatively. So that creates some question if it's before the return of the first exile or after. Interestingly, the Talmud has a tractate on Megillat Esther, the whole story of Esther and the celebration of Purim. And in Megillah 11a, it will identify this as a psalm about the defeat of Haman. And that's why they will say in the end of verse 2, it's Adam, a mortal. It's in the singular, which of course can also be translated as against us humanity, rising up against us humanity. So it can be understood more generically, but because it's Adam, a single person also, it's understood by Haman. And let me show you how creative reading can be. A rare word is the next word in verse 3, azai, here translated as surely. Usually it would be az, without that little yud. Az chayim, then alive they would have swallowed us. And this word azai distinctly is the first word of verses 3, 4, and 5. And 3, 4, and 5 are at the center of the danger. Remember, 6 already is also danger, but it's kind of set apart. So here's gematria. This is just an example of how you can read creatively, not necessarily what was intentioned, but azai equals in gematria, numerology. Aleph is 1, Zion is 7, Yud is 10, equaling 18, times 3 equals 54. Haman's name is mentioned in the book of Esther 54 times. So that is a later commentary, Eretz HaChaim, who underscores the Talmud's claim in the end of verse 2 that this is about Haman. Well, we'll bracket that. That's just kind of the need to fill in unspecified moment with giving it a label, here Haman, and a creative proof of that. But we'll put that back to the side as we return to the pshat, which is the text itself. If not for Adonai, who was for us, verse 2, when rising up against us as a mortal, and now a whole series of potential dangers. Surely alive, they would have swallowed us. So we have that expression, they would have swallowed us alive. Again, I choose to put my English in the order of the Hebrew, but normally you would say, surely they would have swallowed us alive for flow. When their anger kindled, their wrath kindled, flared, blazed against us. The image of being swallowed, and even swallowed alive, has a lot of biblical associations. You get Korach being swallowed alive for rebelling against Moses, Numbers 16:30. You have waters in Psalm 69:16, swallowing the people. You get Jonah getting swallowed alive, Jonah 2:1, an image that will be also used by Jeremiah 51:34. You get the grave swallowing, Sheol swallowing in Numbers and in Proverbs, and you get the enemy swallowing up Israel, Jeremiah 51:34, Hosea 8:7 and 8. So the verb to swallow up has all these associations: waters, ground, fish, the grave, the enemy, of danger, of a quality of an untimely end. And this is when their anger flared against us, and this charot apam, the sense of the anger being like a fire, uncontrolled on some level. And then it shifts from fire as the metaphor of the danger. And I say as the metaphor because some, try to read verses 3 and 5 more literally. So verse 4, surely the waters would have swept us away. The stream would have passed over our soul. And again, soul can be over our neck, over our life. And stream, which is more kind of standard translation of the word nachla in other contexts, is often translated with stronger words like torrent. That's Robert Alter and Benjamin Siegel. Or surge. Mitsuda would translate it as affliction. And the image is here of a desert flash flood. So again, the people who are hearing this psalm in ancient times are often living in and around the desert. And we know how all of a sudden this quality of suddenness, back to being swallowed alive, the unanticipated, you can have in the desert the rain that creates a torrent that can wash away all in its path. Verse 5, surely Azai, the third Azai, it would have passed over our souls. It would have passed over us, over our breathing. And here, Hamayim Hazedonim, the treacherous waters. And this word Zedon is unusual to be used in the context of water. It's almost like giving the waters a quality of thought, because normally its root, Zadon, is for insolent. It's what's describing people who are uncontrolled in their behavior. And so here, that is how the waters are described. Also treacherous in terms of uncontrolled. You can't trust them. And so rapid, building sense of danger, each with a sense of metaphor, and yet a metaphor closely attached to other biblical associations and also physical dangers, that of being swallowed up. There is as well earthquakes in Israel, of the waters, that desert kind of wild flash flood that creates these sudden dangers. And now the pause, but another quality. And it's as if going backwards, verse 3, surely they would have swallowed us. You skip over 4 and 5, and you're back with 3 and 6 being linked in terms of the image of a wild beast. So again, a mortal is rising up against us like a beast. Blessed is Adonai, Baruch Adonai, who did not give us over as prey for their teeth. And the word teref, prey, that's where we get the word treifa, treif, like the food that you can't eat, we call treif. That's because, or teref, an animal that has been torn, tariff is torn. A prey that has been torn is no longer kosher. You can't eat it. And so there's the image here of being torn apart by their teeth. And now the final image of vulnerability, and that's being like a bird. And again, this is a description of the nation. It's a national poem. It's our soul, nafshenu. And the word nafshenu, this is the third time we get nafshenu. We had it in verses 4 as the last word, in verse 5. And now nafshenu is used in verse 7 to describe our soul. It's like a bird. Escape from the snare of fowlers. The snare is broken and we have escaped. Why the image of a bird? And how does it build to this as the crescendo? The Mechilta on Parsha B'Shalach, an early rabbinic commentary, says that birds are delicate and easily injured. So that's one aspect of why, like a bird, we were so vulnerable, so defenseless, like a bird. Others in dream work, bird is identified with spirit, in that it takes wing, it has a quality of freedom, and that's maybe another dimension of the last image, linking soul with a bird. That the fowlers, those who capture birds, it's a specific word, yokshim. This word, though, for snare, mipach. Pach is literally a garbage in modern Hebrew. A pach is a pit. In the Bible, a pach is a pit covered with a net. It's a trap. We've seen it before. Psalm 31:5, Psalm 35, 7 and 8, Psalm 91:3, in Proverbs 7:23. And so it was a trap, a snare that fowlers used, which again, the bird is vulnerable and the unidentified enemy uses treachery, uses that which is hidden to try and capture us. And it's a near-death experience. For indeed, we escaped. We were caught. But the snare is broken. We don't know how. It's nishbar. It's in the passive. Is broken or was broken. And we have escaped. Which leads to the conclusion. Words of celebration and thanksgiving. Ezreinu b'shem Adonai. Our help is in the name of Adonai. And again, the name is identified with God, but once removed, there's a quality of almost humility, of not here addressing God directly. And this phrase, Osei Shemaim Va'aretz, maker of heaven and earth. It's a phrase that occurs 5 times in Psalms. 3 of those times are in these Psalms of Ascent. We saw it for the first time in Psalm 121. We see it here in 134. And so to pull this psalm together, I will add Bach wrote cantatas in honor of this psalm. This is a psalm that is about trust. Despite the dangers of life, sudden, unexpected, in which all kinds of mortal Adam, enemies, analogized to unpredictable natural forces, or a fowler, a person using deceit to capture. Despite all of that, we have survived, we have escaped, and we give thanks to God distinctly as Ezreinu, our help. And back to the overview. As this psalm is structured, it's a communal expression and more. It's a communal song where verse 1 says, "Let us sing," and gives the words, and then the people sing of the dangers and then of the salvation. And so, again, this psalm today distinctly has as my honorees each of you, for this psalm is a reminder of what is gained from singing communally. This is a psalm not of addressing God directly, but of reflection, acknowledging that life has danger, both natural, flash floods, and human, fowlers, and yet those dangers endanger a collective, not just an individual. And when a community has trust and sings together, there is possibility of reflection that leads to rejoicing. And so again, today is a day of my rejoicing, and I thank each of you for being the community with whom I can reflect. With that, I'll stop the share so as to gain. I'm delighted to see how the screens have filled up as in this moment. Any reactions or thoughts to Psalm 124?
Rabbi, I would
Yes.
like to say something
Okay,
about
Shelby.
how you explain swallowed, because I noticed that quite a bit, that image, and that I when I taught middle school, I read a story by Tomas Rivera about migrant workers, and the title was "The Earth Did Not Swallow Us Up." So I thought that that was interesting for me that you brought that up, the experience, how it's related in different parts of the Bible.
Yeah. So this image of being swallowed alive, even that kind of image of swallowed us up, the implication is while alive, is kind of a terrorizing image that your life in a moment you get swallowed up. Um, in that sense, it's an archetype, meaning a foundational human image of fear. Because it's so unpredictable, what comes to my mind are earthquakes living in California, in which people literally can fall into the abyss. Um, or grounds collapsing, like in Florida, where they have all those houses that literally fall into a sinkhole and everything gets swallowed up. So it is a reoccurring kind of image, a metaphor for the unanticipated, un, um, you know, fear that's primal. Other other images that particularly resonated with you, and I will add that it's the first of the images used, just to build on Shelby's comment, and that 3, 4, 5, and 7 are all those dangers. And really, the first one, it'll say in verse 2 is an introduction, when mortals rose up against us. But then the first of the metaphors is being swallowed up alive. Mike, go ahead.
Yes. One thing I noticed was with the use of our soul, that it besides the physical, there's a spiritual dimension that are the dangers. And if you take heaven and earth, and the heaven being spiritual, you have both the physical and the spiritual.
So I'll just build on Mike's identification, then I'll call on Irene in a moment. And that is, it also here, the word nephesh, as Mike said, can be understood in both the physical and the spiritual way. And we've seen that before. Sometimes the word nephesh can be throat. And in that sense, when it says avar al nafshenu, describing the water, it's as if the water overcame our throat. Often it's translated as, instead of passed over, it's overcame. And so that's the physical. Nephesh can be understood as throat in the most foundational physical way. And we've seen in other Psalms the use of nafshenu, where throat was the more immediate understanding. But the rabbis understood nephesh as spirit also, because it's with our throats that we breathe in breath. Breath is life. Life is spirit. For the rabbi's soul is what is not seen, but what generates animation, what enables life. And so that's spirit. Literally, spiritus in Latin is breath. And so nephesh is both breath and soul. And so the metaphors here, as Mike says, can be not only of the physical kind, but of the spiritual kind. Or to give it a bigger context, if this is a psalm of surviving the dangers of exile, whether Babylonia or the longer trajectory, as much as physical danger was spiritual danger of not being washed away by the larger current of culture. Irene, last insight, and then I'll pull it together.
Yes, just briefly, when the chief rabbi of Haifa was asked to speak in Lithuania in 1997, for the 200th anniversary of the Vilna Gaon's death, he didn't want to go because of Lithuania's stance during the Holocaust. And then he quoted Ovadia 1:11, which is very similar. That's what, because about swallowing up, and if the day you stood aloof, you became of them. So he actually accused them of being like the Adam that is in that verse. He accused them, the parliament in Lithuania in 1997, and they applauded him. And, you know, he was saying that's what you did during the Shoah. So he'd actually, I think he was thinking of both that the Psalm and the Ovadia, which isn't as well known. For so many centuries in Lithuania, it was the Jerusalem of Europe in Vilna, wasn't it?
Yeah. I don't know.
And they just massacred them all, and this was the up, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's so. You faded in and out a bit, Irene, in terms of reception. At least
it did. It came in very low.
So again, to pull that together,
Yeah.
that image, did he read Psalm 124 before the parliament?
No, I think it was the Ovadia. No, I think I mean what happened was when I did the translation, I went for I thought it was Ovadia, but I now think it's a psalm, more or less. Yes, we would have been swallowed up if not for, you know, God being there. You would have swallowed us alive. It was they that were like the earthquake, because of people living there such a long time. Centuries. I don't think, you know, if you're American, you may not, I don't know whether, you know, in the West we realize just what it was like for people that had lived there for centuries, with people turning on them like that, you know. But he was actually attacking the parliament in the, you know, in our day, not the parliament then. So he said they hadn't really, you know, made amends properly. That's,
Well, that's a very powerful image. Thank you, Irene. And the way you also linked it to the Jerusalem of the East, which was the nickname for Vilna, because Vilna in the end of the 18th, 19th centuries was the major Talmudic academy. In fact, yeshiva itself is identified as a creation of Lithuania, as in terms of being created in so many of the leading yeshivot in Israel, the Panyevich Yeshiva, the Mir Yeshiva, are cities of Lithuania. And in that regard, for Jews who were so settled in exile, they were indeed swallowed up. And it was sadly the Lithuanians who did, Lithuanian police, who did so much of that murder ring in World War II, not even the Germans, but the Lithuanians themselves. And that's the image of Psalm 124 that Irene links. And that is, there is the sense of a sudden change. And that's part of the history of the exile. Places where Jews were feeling safe and settled, all of a sudden it's as if the earth swallowed them up. That earth representing where you were, feeling grounded, all of a sudden, and that's the images that are used here of the flash flood, of the fire that has this quality of flaring up, and even that of the fowler with the bird, and using a quality of unanticipated danger for the bird. And yet, this is a psalm of communal thanksgiving. This is a psalm that leads to saying, and yet we are here, and yet we have survived, and we are grateful to God. Tomorrow, Psalm 125 will speak about security, imagining our security to being comparable to the mountains around Jerusalem in terms of being encircled by mountains, protection. So it will say, God encircles us and enables our safety in otherwise a dangerous world. And what the Psalms do have in common, they're not all so sweet, because life with open eyes is dangerous. And it's owning that it's dangerous is part of spiritual maturity, and yet finding trust in the longer trajectory, finding trust in God as being our companion and safety maker enables celebration. So with Psalm 124 as part of our carrying forward our sense of hope despite danger,